Ever wonder what really goes on in the world of offshore oil rigs, wind farms, and the energy industry that powers your life? Find the answers to those questions and more on the podcast Wind, Waves, and Wells with Joe. Wind, Waves, and Wells with Joe pulls back the curtain and shares the raw, unfiltered stories from the front lines of energy. From offshore drilling disasters to wind turbine advancements, Joe brings on people who've lived it, worked it, and have the scars or the laughs to prove it. When you tune into Wind, Waves, and Wells with Joe, you'll hear jaw-dropping experiences like being 100 meters underwater with no air, to real conversations about safety, environmental impact, and the politics that don't make it into the brochures. It's insight, storytelling, and sometimes controversy, and always honest. If you're an energy insider or just someone curious about the wild world that keeps the lights on, Wind, Waves, and Wells with Joe is the podcast for you. Available on Spotify, Apple Podcast, and wherever you listen to podcasts. Real people, real stories, no filter. Wind, Waves, and Wells with Joe. Start listening right now.
To Aberdeen recently, and I was reading an article last night actually about that's the first time Keir Starmer's ever been to Aberdeen since coming in to power. I was pretty
minister,
I was actually pretty amazed. Like it's taken Donald Trump to kind of get him to come up.
The last time he was up here, he was actually in my constituency at
the
St Fergus gas terminal.
Right.
I was actually I remember when he came up, I actually had a bit of a pop with my own party leadership, because there was Keir Starmer, Anas Sarwar, Ed Miliband, Michael Shanks wouldn't have been there at the time, Ian Murray, the Secretary of State for Scotland, what's her name, Sarah Boyack, the MSP Labour spokesperson in Holyrood. Like, they had a cast of thousands representing Labour at the site for the Acorn Carbon Capture project. And we had Rishi Sunak come up when he was Prime Minister, and individuals. We never had everyone at the same time. I says, come on, lads, hire yourself a minibus and I'll buy you all a pint after.
Yeah.
The only time I've ever spoken to Keir Starmer actually was immediately after that. I bumped into him at Parliament, and I said, I hope you enjoyed your trip up to my constituency. And he seemed quite keen on the whole carbon capture stuff, which obviously I was, but it was a big deal in my constituency. That's about the only time I've ever spoken to him.
What did you make of him?
Pretty much the same as I make of him now. I think there's certain things he's well on top of, because I was on top of his brief, and he comes across quite self-assured. And there's other things, like energy, where I don't think it's his wheelhouse. And I just see him as being a bit, you better talk to Ed about that kind of thing.
Oh, really?
Whereas somebody like Trump, I mean, say what you like about Trump, but when you ask him a question, he certainly comes across like as if he knows what he's talking about, or he seems like he's been briefed. And I think you'd say the same about Rishi Sunak. I think was always very impressive at being. It was very difficult to surprise Rishi with a left field question, but I just find with Starmer that he's a little bit out of his depth sometimes.
I sometimes feel the way that Ed Miliband comes across just from like listening to interviews and stuff with him. He's very forceful. He tries to overtalk a lot of the time, and the one thing I've noticed now is the big thing he says it's the international market that sets everything. That seems to be, I think,
that's one of the standard lines. The oil and gas price is set by the international market. It goes to the highest bidder. Oil and gas will be with us for years to come. There's a whole bunch of these lines that they come out with routinely, and they don't really mean much. And I saw Starmer say that when he was with the president yesterday, saying when he was asked about the future of oil and gas, and he just came out with the standard line: oil and gas will be with us for decades. But they never say how much oil and gas, and they never say where it's going to come from. Whether it's going to come from the North Sea, or whether it's going to come from the Middle East or the Americas.
Yeah, as the briefing's almost right, guys. This is all we're saying. We don't really know enough about, and we've not really got decent enough policies to kind of convince the right people. So we'll just keep using the international market.
And one of the things I've learned, I did learn as a politician, was any prime minister maybe talking directly to a bunch of people from one industry, but more so than trying to impress that cohort um, on the basis of their industry, what they're trying to do more often than not is appeal to the cameras and appeal to the general public that are going to be watching that in the 6 o'clock news or 10 o'clock news later that day, which is often the case. You'll have people coming out of their room. I'll say all politicians do this, or all political leaders do this. They're appealing to the camera rather than the people in the room, because there's a hell of a lot more people watching the 6 o'clock news than the couple of hundred or so in that room.
Yeah.
So sometimes those lines that we've just said, that we export most of our oil, it's sold in the open market to the highest bidder, it doesn't belong to us, it's owned by private companies. All of these things are true, but actually meaningless when it comes to setting policy on what is decided and that will impact jobs, the economy, the future of our own ability to transition from oil and gas to renewables if we don't keep a hold of the skills and technologies and supply chains that we have. So these lines don't really mean much to people actually in the industry, but they seem to keep everyone else quiet.
Yeah, which is, unfortunately, I don't think, and I've said it time and time again, I don't think the energy industry is appreciated enough for what it actually contributes to. But we could talk about politics all day, but I want to talk about David Duguid. How did it all start?
Crikey. Well, a long time ago, a very long time ago, I was actually thinking of this, and I think about this very often when I listen to your podcast. I hear your guests being asked the same questions, and I try and imagine how I would answer them,
Yeah.
and it just makes me feel so old. I started in oil and gas back in 1992, which is probably before
That's
you
the
were
year I
born,
was
but
born, just to let you
was
know.
this?
That's
Oh, well, that's thanks. I made me sure you told it.
yeah.
But I had no intention of studying chemistry. I was going to go to art school. All the time I was through school, I wanted to be an architect. But I don't know. I went to visit Gray's School of Art in Aberdeen, and I was looking at all this work that the students have been doing, and I thought, I'm not that good. And it wasn't until a lot later I realised that, yeah, but these were people that had been to art school for 4 or 5 years. But I just had a crisis of confidence, and I decided, right, I'm not going to go to art school. What else was I good at school? I did all right in chemistry. So I just, okay, let's go and study chemistry. And then, yeah, I came out of university, struggled to get a job initially, usual, so about 5, 6 months. And then got a job working for a chemical sales and service company, mostly working onshore in the lab, but being sent offshore occasionally on an ad hoc basis, which does wonders for your social life. As I've heard you and some of your guests discussed before, the pros and cons of being ad hoc versus being on a steady rotation. So I never knew from one week to the next whether I was going offshore or not, and which wasn't ideal. I spent about a year and a half with that company, and then I went to work for another company, which was basically just working in a lab. So I wasn't trying to sell chemicals. I wasn't trying to um, show that my company's chemicals were better than any other companies. I was just an independent analyst taking samples and telling the customer what was in them. And so I enjoyed that. It was very independent. I wasn't trying to sell anything. But again, I was still required to do the odd ad hoc offshore trip, usually doing holiday cover for the guys that were on rotation. So it was only a matter of time, really, when I realised that these guys on rotation are getting half of their year at home, and they're getting paid about 50% more than I get paid. So it doesn't take long to do the maths and think, yeah, I didn't set out living to do offshore 2 on 2 off, but that's where I ended up in 1994, and on the Fortis field, which essentially isn't really there anymore. I think certainly I think the Fortis Alpha platform I was on is gone. Again, it's when you see all these. Sorry, skipping back to my time selling chemicals. I used to do scale inhibitor squeezes up in the Brentfield. And seeing those platforms being decommissioned, it was really quite, but it brings a lump to your throat when that's a place I used to work. It's really impressive the way they do it though. Where was I? Oh yeah. So I started my first full-time rotational job in Forties in '94. Did that for about 3 years. Then I went to the Andrew field. Did that essentially the same job for another couple of years. And then in '99, I did my first overseas job in Venezuela. And that was a 3 weeks on, 3 weeks off, back and forth rotation job. I didn't have a back-to-back, which again has pros and cons. So you don't have a back-to-back doing things completely differently from the way you do things. But the downside is you don't have a back-to-back doing anything.
Yeah.
So you turn up and you spend your first week just catching up with all the stuff that hasn't been getting done. But I really enjoyed that. I mean, Venezuela, it has its own issues as a country, but by the time you've flown into Caracas and get on ever smaller and smaller planes to your final destination, and I was in a place called Pedernales, the last vehicle that actually took me to the platform was a boat that held about 9 people. And it was classed as offshore, but it was actually on a river delta. I don't know if it was the actual Orinoco River, but it was in that sort of vicinity. So it was classed as offshore, but you were actually surrounded both sides of this river by jungle and all the birds that I've never even seen before or heard of before, of all colours and shapes and sizes. It was fantastic. Can't remember much about the job, but actually being in the jungle, seeing all this wildlife was fantastic. That was only for about 6 months before essentially the owner of that field got bought over by another operator that decided they didn't need a production chemist. I said, okay, good luck with that. I'm off to Canada. So I spent, again, I was a 2 on 2 off offshore Canada. And when I say offshore Canada, you'll be thinking Hibernian, but no, it was the Sable gas project, just offshore Nova Scotia. And again, that was a nice little job. It was quite an easy job. But I don't know. It just felt like I was doing the same job I'd been doing 5 years earlier. And it wasn't a 2 and 2 rotation coming home. It was a 2 and 2 rotation living in Canada. So I was spending my 2 weeks off in Canada, not knowing anyone, and that wasn't ideal either. So during that job, I had my first experience being headhunted to help out a small team of production efficiency specialists back in Aberdeen. Again, this was my first time back in the office when after being offshore for 7-8 years or so. And then after about 6 months of doing that job, I was taken on full time by BP, who I worked with for the next 11 years. So in that next 11 years was mostly office based, but again going back to some the occasional, very occasional ad hoc trip, which was a lot easier to deal with because there were fewer and farther between. But my main experience offshore was in that period between '94 and 2000 until where did I get to? So when I got back to Aberdeen, production of chemistry, just to give you an idea, it gives you a very holistic overview of the whole oil and gas value stream, from the reservoir through the wells, through the manifolds and processing facilities, through to the export systems. You also gives you a feel for the commercial markets trading side of things. And a lot of people I worked with in production chemistry ended up in trading or what they call hydrocarbon accounting. But I decided to stick to this production efficiency, operations excellence, coaching kind of role. But by the time, after a couple of years of doing that for BP essentially decided that, certainly in the North Sea, that they didn't really need any more internal coaches because they thought, rightly or wrongly, like, we've cracked this production efficiency stuff in the North Sea, so we don't really need your skills doing that anymore. But they did try to steer me in a different direction, a more specialist direction. So I then spent the next couple of years, or 3 years, as an integrity engineer. And again, integrity management historically was the kind of role that was filled by mechanical engineers, specialists in structural engineering, welding, etc., pipelines. But actually, throughout my early career, whether it was offshore or onshore, the day-to-day management of oil and gas production was getting a lot more data-driven, as was the case for integrity management and process safety as well. So I ended up kind of falling into my comfort zone of using data and analysing that data, providing management with a kind of story of what the current state of reality was to help them make decisions. So I was doing that for a while, but it kind of still felt like I don't know, I wasn't really getting anywhere. After you get into a job and you start getting good at it, and you reach a point where it's about as good as you're going to get, and you start looking for maybe other opportunities. And it was just about then, again, they were looking for people to do the production and efficiency coaching training role that I used to do. They didn't want to do it in the North Sea anymore, but they were looking to spread around BP's operations around the world. So this is when, again, I got a call from a guy, or an email from a guy I used to work with in Venezuela, who was setting up a team in Azerbaijan. And I thought, well, again, it's kind of going back to what I used to do, but hey, it's Azerbaijan, it's a new country, it's a new experience. So I ended up doing that for a couple of years. Uh, Again, not so much offshore, more on the Sangachal terminal over there, but also, yeah, working for the offshore assets as well, but from an office base. And after 2 years of that, where I met my wife, by the way, well, she wasn't my wife at the time, obviously. She
Yeah.
is now. I then went and did the same thing in Angola, but this time it was a month on, month off. So I was back being full-time offshore, 4 weeks at a time, and then home for 4 weeks. So I think I did that for another 2 years. And then, having done that for 2 years, BP said, right, you're done in Angola, we want you to go to Iraq. And I had misgivings about that, not because it was Iraq, but because I thought, right, I've just done the same job for 2 years in Azerbaijan. I've done the same job in Angola for the last 2 years. And now you're wanting me to do the same again in Iraq. It's like, I really fancy doing something different. So I would have happily gone to Iraq. It was just the sameness of the job that was putting me off a little bit. I said, what else have you got? Back when it was perhaps more of an employee's market. And they said, well, we could give you a desk job back in Aberdeen. I said, oh no, tell me more about Iraq. I said, because by this time I'd kind of given up on the idea that I was built for working 9 to 5 in an office. And so I was on a bit of a hiatus and sort of half thinking of going to Iraq. And again, this was my second appearance at being experience, I should say, at being headhunted. And this time it was by a consultancy company who were looking for people of my ilk to join a team of going offshore and coaching operations team and how to analyze that data, how to look for improvements and how to implement those improvements. Again, it wasn't the kind of consultancy company that goes offshore and presents a nice glossy document for everyone to ignore and then come back 6 months and say, well, you didn't do it. This was very much, again, my kind of thing where, yes, we did the analysis. We worked with the teams offshore for them essentially to tell us what the problems were, but then help facilitate a process by which their knowledge and understanding and experience became actionable activity that could be implemented and measured. And so you could actually tell when they've been completed and delivered value. So I quite enjoyed doing that and did that for the next 6 or 7 years. After about 6 years, the company I was working for decided to lay off that operational implementation side of consultancy. They wanted to just go back to data and digital and just focus on that. So I thought, well, there's still value in what I do. So I came to the conclusion that, well, okay, fine, I'll take my redundancy payment for what it was worth. I think that would have kept me going for the next 3 months or whatever, and just set myself up on my own, which I did then for the next 9 months. And I found myself literally between clients. I wasn't like now, I could maybe describe myself as being between jobs,
Yeah.
colloquially, but at the time, I was literally looking forward to another job, maybe 2 months down the line, which was all sort of set out for me. And it was about that time Theresa May decided to call a snap general election. And I joined the local branch of the Scottish Conservative Party a couple of years previously. It was just after the independence referendum. And I just thought, although the no side won that referendum, I just thought there was more that could have been done to make that a more certain victory, at least in my mind, at least. And so I joined the party, and one day I was delivering leaflets for the local councillors who were up for election that same time. And then a couple of weeks later, I was stuffing envelopes and delivering leaflets, knocking on doors, doing exactly the same thing, but for my own election campaign, because they couldn't get any other person to stand in my seat.
Right.
There were a few people asked, I believe, that rejected the opportunity because they didn't think it could be won. The SNP at the time held a majority of about close to 15,000, and it was a lost cause kind of thing. But they needed somebody to put their name on the paper. I said, yeah, I'll give it a bash. I've got some spare time. And it's not often that would happen. I really feel for candidates who they're probably currently doing a full-time job, but if they want to be a candidate and stand in an election for what could be up to a couple of months, they have to basically take a leave of unpaid absence from their work to be able to do that. Whereas I was quite happily living off the earnings of a consultancy job I'd done for a 6-month period. Before that, I had my business model sorted out that if I did about a month. If I could do a month's work, that would keep me going for 2 months, kind of thing. And so, yeah, what I thought was just going to be a bit of an experience ended up being my job for the next 7 years.
How much do you think you took from offshore life into politics?
Well, there's a lot, I think, came from my experience working offshore that, I don't know, it's difficult to explain to anybody that doesn't work offshore. But there's a lifestyle to it. There's an edge that I think it gives you. And just living a more productive life. When you're offshore, it's organised. There's a plan that you're working to, but anything can happen, and you've really got to keep your wits about you on a day-to-day basis. I think the fact that you're living and working on a hopefully safe but intrinsically hazardous facility, I mean, that's always in the back of your mind. It's certainly in your subconscious at all times. And that, even if you're thoroughly enjoying your job, there's a stress associated with that. And I think it just toughens you up generally for life. And even just the locker room banter. I think just if you don't have a thick skin when you go offshore, you'll certainly develop one. And I think that thick skin served me well as a politician, because as soon as you become an elected politician, people who used to say hello to you in the pub previously all of a sudden hate your guts because you're not an MP for their party. And then you bump into them. It was a really strange experience. I was at I think it was a 50th birthday party for a friend of mine from school, and there was a whole bunch of us got together, hadn't seen each other for years, and a couple of whom had been really quite nasty, in a very social media nasty kind of way, to me since I became a Conservative MP. But when I saw them at this social gathering, they were like, "Hey Dave, how you doing? Go on, goodbye a pint." It was like, well, hold on, are you the same guy that was just slagging me off last week? And apparently they weren't. This is a strange thing. The person who's slagging you off on social media is not the same person you had a beer with in the pub, it turns out. When you hear the expression keyboard warriors, I think it's true. People get behind a keyboard. They don't really feel that it's them that's doing it. it's something inside them they want to get out, and it goes out there into the social media ether. But there's a certain amount of the of lack of liability, culpability for what they say, because it's just them venting. I mean, okay, there are people who just cross the street rather than talk to me, but I think it's because they're embarrassed rather than anything that I'm doing wrong. And so I think generally in life, I think working offshore gives you an edge that other jobs don't necessarily give you. Maybe working in armed forces does something similar. I wouldn't know. Well, I kind of would know because I did some experience working alongside the RAF as a sort of parliamentary armed forces scheme. The MPs have the fantastic opportunity to take part in. And if there are any MPs listening who hasn't had a chance to do that yet, I would thoroughly recommend it. You basically put on a uniform and you're just one of the lads out on a... I mean, they're not putting you in any harm's way or anything. You're just kind of wandering about the barracks or just checking out what to do. I had a very interesting trip to the Falklands. Saw some penguins. It was great.
Oh.
But
should maybe try and implement that for MPs and going offshore as well, so they're going to maybe understand a little bit more about what's going on up there. It'll be a good implementation role.
I think, there's a lot to be said for that. Not just politicians, but I think people that work in the industry that don't really spend a lot of time offshore. They might go, again, for politicians and oil and gas executives, I think it would be hugely valuable if they went offshore and didn't just dress up in the new shiny boiler suit and green hat, but actually spoke to people and learned the truth from people about what their work is like, what their life is like. Not just life offshore, but life when they're home. I think there's a really good video, I don't know if you've seen it, about was it a town called Bruce? About the Bruce platform.
No, I haven't seen that actually.
It's well worth looking up. I'll send you the link to it if I can find it.
Awesome, yeah.
But it just interviews some seemingly random technicians, OIMs, onshore engineers about how they all interact with each other and what their family life, their home life's like. And it's the closest thing I've seen to something that actually presents what it's like. But again, just scratches the surface really.
Yeah.
You can't. I don't know if you find this, but when I started working offshore, and people ask me what I did, I'd go into the details of I go around the platform every morning and I take samples and I check that the scale inhibitor pumps are working, and I just see them glazing over.
Yeah.
And I just say, I work on the rigs. It's just easier. Look at it.
It's easier. Yeah.
Oh, you work on the rigs, right? Okay. So you get all that money and you get all those holidays. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh God. Yeah. That's the next thing that comes out.
I always explain to people. I said, no, I don't get holidays, and you'll appreciate this. When you're working on a rotation, you're out there for 2 weeks, 3 weeks, whatever it is, and you're out there when you're working, but you're out there when you're sleeping. You're out there when you're eating. You're out there if you have any social time, going to the gym. You're out there. That's you there for 2 weeks. Now, your normal sort of office-based person who does an 8-hour stint in the office then comes home and spends time with their wife and kids. And I mean, I appreciate it's probably better now with FaceTime and much better broadband, Starlink. When I first worked in the Fortis Alpha platform, was maybe one phone between 200 guys. We had to buy phone cards and stand in a queue, and about 10 minutes maximum. So it was all part of there was an actual hardship to it. And I'm not saying there isn't now. There is, because no matter what mod cons you get, you're still away. You're still out there and you're away from your family. And your family don't know if... I mean, my wife was... she was always, shall we say, nervous of me working offshore in Angola. And I said, it's safe as houses. It's a brand new FPSO. It's not going to blow up anytime soon. It would anyway, because of the methods and procedures and the safety process controls that are in place. I was always trying to reassure her, but I'm probably safer out here than she was trying to pass her test. And I always used to say, look, Angola it's not that bad. She, oh no, I don't like the idea of Angola. What she didn't understand, she was from Azerbaijan. I was talking to people back in the UK who thought Azerbaijan was a scary place.
Yeah.
And it was one of the best kept secrets in BP. I think it was the third best paying hardship allowance for being away from home. But it was an absolutely fantastic place. I love it. I'd
Yeah.
go back there as much as I can, obviously with the family connections. But it's what you don't know. You're nervous about what you don't know. And she was nervous about being in Angola. And I would say, look, Angola's fine. Oh, I've heard all these stories about Nigeria. Well, Angola's different than Nigeria. Now, I've never been to Nigeria, but I've heard stories about Nigeria as well. But had I actually lived and worked there, I'd have probably thought less of it. But I said to
Yeah.
her, look, Angola's not as bad as Nigeria. So that seemed to calm her down. Until later on when I was doing my consultancy job, and I got offered the chance to go to Nigeria for a very lucrative contract, and my wife was just, no, you're not going to Nigeria. So I kind of walked myself right into that one.
Yeah. It's yeah, it is quite funny. I totally agree with majority of views as well. Actually, like there's not really. I think there is a sense of there is a what if, but I think also I think men and women when they go offshore are very good at kind of parking that to the side and kind of just getting on with things. I was just speaking with a mate there. We went out to walk the dogs. He works offshore as well. He was working in Congo for a bit, and then I said to him, "Yeah, I'm away tomorrow. 5 weeks." He's, "Oh God, the thought of 5 weeks." But yeah, when you're here, 5 weeks is like, "Oh my God, yeah." But I think once you're out there, I think you're quite quick to kind of switch off and kind of just get on with things. That's always been my experience. I'm not on platforms now. I've moved into vessels, so it's a little bit less hazardous, should we say?
Mm.
Don't get me wrong, anything could happen. But yeah, I think all people that work offshore are very good at just kind of sticking it to the side. Yeah, I think
I,
men and women are very good at parking it when they go out there. I think that's probably the first thing you kind of do. You get in the thought process of traveling and whatnot, and then once you're in, I think you're quite quick to kind of switch on and get straight into it. That's always been my experience from it anyway.
for me, it was always like that Sunday evening feeling of, oh, I've got school tomorrow. And
Yeah,
then you'd go to school the next morning and you're fine. You're catching up with your pals. It was very similar. The day before going offshore, it was like, oh, I'm going offshore for a couple of weeks. But then you go offshore and it's exactly the same. You got your pals offshore. It's the only place you ever see them.
yeah,
Uh, very often. I mean, occasionally, I've probably made a couple of friendships that I've retained and still catch up with people. Um, Occasionally, but generally, your pals offshore are the guys you meet up with and work with offshore, especially if you're on
yeah,
a steady rotation.
yeah.
Yeah, so I think it's in answer to your earlier question about what do you get from working offshore that helps you in any walk of life. I think I called it an edge, but I think it's a resilience.
Mm,
You builds up a sort of a sort of thick skin to being able to not just being able to tolerate what life throws at you, but also understanding that if I don't deal with this problem, my back to backs are going to have to deal with it,
mm.
and you get a sense of responsibility for doing your job. Like if you're on day shift, you want to get that job finished so that the night shift guy doesn't slag you off in the morning for
Or says it
leaving him
behind your
stuck at
back.
8. Well, yeah, more often than not. But
Yeah,
no,
yeah.
I mean, I think that's certainly what it did for me anyway. I think it built up a work. I would like to say it expanded on my work ethic. Because I think growing up in a farm, I think I already had a kind of, you either do the job or the job doesn't get done,
Yeah.
or you get your arse kicked by your father, or, or
Uh,
the job doesn't go away. So,
no.
and it was a bit like that offshore. It's like, okay, here's your job. You've got a job to do. Nobody else is going to come along and do it for you. And it's a
Mm.
very, very small, insular location that you're working in. You can't pop off to the shops at lunchtime or like
Get
I said
away from
earlier,
it.
go home and see your wife and kids in the evening.
Yeah.
You're there and you're surrounded by your peers. And so I think there's that shared responsibility of not just keeping everyone safe, which is obviously intrinsic, but or certainly more intrinsic than it would have been in the past. But yeah, making sure that you're all there to do a job. You're all there to make sure that the oil and gas flows or the wind turbine gets built. and you soon get caught out if you're slacking.
Yeah. Well, when I well, obviously when we first started speaking on LinkedIn and stuff, I said, is there anything in particular you'd like to kind of go over? And one of the things you said is to get across the difference between drill baby drill and just stop oil.
Mm.
What 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 are your views on the two?
Well, the, the issue I have is whenever you read a paper or watch news on TV, what's being reported is usually either one of those ends of the extreme. And I personally feel, I think, particularly on the environmental end of the extreme, the just stop oil end of the extreme has become, I think we've allowed, politically as well as in the media, we've allowed that to become the assumed mainstream. So whatever Greta Thunberg says, that's what we have to do as a society. But I would argue that's just one view, and I think it's quite an extreme view that's held by people who would just shut down the oil and gas industry tomorrow.
Yeah.
We would stop burning fossil fuels tomorrow. And when you try to put across the downside of that, i.e. 80% of the world would lose its energy overnight, and you
Yeah.
challenge people, so who gets to make that decision? Who gets to decide who gets energy and who doesn't? Because you basically just switched off 80% of the world's lights, or factories, or hospitals. And I've spoken, as an MP, I've spoken to so many people that just don't care about that. It's like, well, we don't care. We've got to save the planet. We've got to save our children. We've got to look out for future generations. Say, well, those same children, that same future generations, they need schools, they need hospitals, they need infrastructure for their lives to work. It's not all about saving the planet. And I think, by all means, call out industries such as oil and gas, but even more so the businesses and the industries that use the oil and gas and burn it. And they're the ones that actually create the most emissions. So by all means, call them out when they're not behaving the way they should. They're not following the rules. They're not following regulations. And by the way, the UK is one of the most, if not the most, environmentally regulated oil and gas industry in the world.
Yeah, I can
And you
imagine.
can't. And that from day one, my job offshore was about stopping oil getting into the water, stopping us flaring too much. It was all about stabilizing the oil, gas, water separation, so they didn't have excess oil going into the effluent into the sea. You didn't have excess flare, or you didn't have excess water going down the pipeline with the oil, which could potentially cause corrosion and leaks in the future. So it was about keeping it contained from a production chemistry point of view. So you've got that side, but then you've got the other extreme of let's just ignore the environmental campaigners altogether. Let's just ignore climate change. Let's just deny climate change. Let's just cancel net zero. I mean, you hear a lot of this. I mean, one of the most annoying 3-word phrases I hear coming time and time again. I won't say which party because you'll know as soon as I say it. There's this expression, net stupid zero. It doesn't even make grammatical sense. What does that mean? In fact, net zero doesn't really. When people use net zero as a thing to attack, oh, we need to stop doing this net zero stuff. It's again from the scientific, analytical side of me. I just get a bit OCD about people's use of terminology. Net zero is a potential outcome, maybe, if we're able to reduce our emissions or capture our emissions to such a point where the UK becomes a net zero emitter. Great. It's maybe a line in the sand that we can set out for some time in the future. I think we've blown it for 2050, but it's a line in the sand that you can draw somewhere. That's fine. But all the stuff that we've tried to do under the banner of net zero, a lot of it doesn't make sense in that context. So net zero is something you might aim for. Landing a man on the moon, it's something you would aim for, but then the things you try to do to get to that objective then need to be assessed and measured and prioritized very carefully against all your other priorities. So, and I think what's happened in the last 10 years or so it's almost become a religion of whatever, like any idea that somebody comes up with that's going to be good for net zero, whatever that means, doesn't get questioned. And you dare not question it. Otherwise you get labelled as a heretic. But at the same time, it frustrates me when people say, "Oh, we just need to stop all this net zero crap," because again, that doesn't mean anything to me with my understanding of the industry. And what I'd like to see, and what I hear more often than not from the oil and gas industry themselves, are proposals and objectives and plans for how we can increase our clean energy output, while at the same time, or in the meantime, reduce the emissions of our current production and reduce and manage the reduction in that production in such a way that the skills, the technologies, and the supply chains are kept in this country in order to help with the transition from where we are today to where we need to be in future. Again, another phrase that annoys the hell out of me is, "Oh, we need a just transition." Again, I really don't know what that means. I've heard various definitions.
Yeah.
But what the best definition I've been able to come up with is, we've already decided the industry's shot. It's gone. It's going to die. So we need to find new jobs for these guys that are going to be unemployed. I think it comes from the closure of the mines back in the 80s, and there was a whole bunch of people, whole societies left. I think there was an assumption, this might be surprising coming from a conservative, but there was a flaw in Thatcher Reagan economics. And that flaw was the assumption that people in these mining communities would say, "Oh, well, the local jobs are gone. Let's travel 100 miles south, north, wherever, to go where the jobs are." Now, some people did that. I worked with a lot of them offshore. But most people tend to want to stay where they stay. They live where they live. That's where their family are. That's where their friends are. That's where their roots are. That's where their house is. That's where their children go to school. And it's a false assumption to just assume that people are going to go where the jobs are. And so I think there is a certain amount of consideration has to be, or should have maybe been paid to that in the past. But I think in oil and gas, it's such a mobile workforce. I mean, I've heard so many of the people you've spoken to have described my own history. There are so many jobs in oil and gas around the world if you're able to go, if you're mobile enough. And there's so much demand out there that my biggest fear is not that you're going to have a bunch of oil and gas guys queuing up at the job centre. My biggest fear is that all these very skillful, experienced, still enough time in their career to make a career are going to say, "Well, North Sea's dead. I'm going to go work in the Middle East, or I'm going to go work in South America." And then they end up delivering someone else's energy security, producing oil and gas that we end up importing because we don't have the wherewithal to produce our own anymore. The fact is, we've been a net importer since 2004. But we could, estimates by the North Sea Transition Authority and Offshore Energies UK, we could produce at least half of our own oil and gas, or half of the oil and gas that we use. But what this government in particular seemed to be trying to do is wind down the oil and gas industry as fast as possible, purely for virtue signalling reasons. I'm sorry, I'm being a bit political here, but I'm a recovering politician. But I think it seems to be more important to a lot of politicians, and I count some politicians, without naming any, in my own party when we were in government, who seemed to be more interested in what the world thought than what the actual impact was of what we were doing to our own country. Ultimately, if we stop producing our own oil and gas, but we don't address the demand side, in other words, we still need that oil and gas, and so we end up importing it, especially gas in the form of LNG, from Qatar, US, South America, then we actually add to the overall emissions. But it will look good on our own UK only scorecard. We're not producing oil and gas, tick. We're importing oil and gas, but yeah, it's fine. We still need it. And
exactly.
I think the worst example of that is the so-called Finch judgment, which I think the government should have actively challenged, which was this idea that oil and gas producers, to get consent for new productions like Rosebank, Jackdaw, Campbell, need to take into consideration their environmental assessments, the so-called Scope 3 emissions. Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions are the emissions that the operator are physically and directly responsible for. Scope 3 emissions are those emissions that come from the burning of oil and gas by the consumer. And so, yes, I think it's maybe easy for oil and gas operators to say, well, that's not our problem. And I think that maybe is. It's like saying tobacco producers. Yeah, tobacco kills people. Yeah, but that's not our problem. We're not forcing people to smoke. So I think there is an element of needing to have some awareness of that, but just to, as Greenpeace, Friends of the Earth, and others have tried to do, they've effectively put these cases to court to try and shut down the North Sea oil and gas industry. Now, I'm confident that the oil and gas industry will find a way to take account of those Scope 3 emissions in their environmental assessments and get that consent through. They have to, because the only alternative is we don't produce that oil and gas from our own fields. We don't create jobs. We don't maintain skills and supply chains in this country. We potentially lose out in tens of billions of pounds of equity to the exchequer that is woefully needed in these difficult times. And what we end up doing is just buying it in from elsewhere. And it's that for me is just madness. And there's a lot of people in the middle ground saying precisely what I've just said, that yes, produce more renewables, but until we get to full dependency or 80% dependency, which is predicted by the Climate Change Committee by 2050, because they say it will still be oil and gas by then. 20% of our energy demand will be from oil and gas. Yeah, by all means, go for that objective. But in the meantime, while we still need oil and gas as a community, as an economy, let's make sure we get as much of that from our own sources as we can. And it's not just about profit for the oil and gas companies, although that's part of it. If there was no profit in it for them, they wouldn't do it.
No.
But it's about those jobs and communities and the economy and in public funds. I was reading an article the other day. I can't remember who wrote it. It may have been on LinkedIn, but somebody was asked the question, who's made the most profit from oil and gas over the years? And governments have made the most money off of oil and gas without risking any capital. They just take the tax revenue. And you get that tax revenue by allowing the activity to go ahead with certain caveats and guidelines and regulations. But just by putting the tax rate up to stupid amounts, that just stops the activity from happening, and you don't get a tax return. So, that brings us on to the windfall tax, the energy profits levy.
Yeah,
it was kind of necessary temporarily, but we haven't been in windfall conditions for a couple of years now. Other countries who have implemented something similar have rolled back on their windfall tax schemes, but we haven't, for what I can only assume to be ideological reasons, and nothing else. Sorry, I'm getting a bit political there.
No, that's fine. No. I was actually going to say, I think I'd be questioned if I didn't ask you. I mean, it was you guys that brought the windfall tax in the first place. Mm-hmm. How much longer was it planned? Say Conservatives got back in. What was the plan? Was there ever a plan to take the windfall tax off?
The original plan when it was first implemented was it would run until November 2025. And it came with significant capital investment allowances against that tax rate. It was extended by Jeremy Hunt in the last financial statement he made a year past March. It was extended by, I think, was it another year or another 2 years? But what was also introduced at that same time, or at least a little bit later, in the Finance Act number 2, or Finance number 2 Act, which contained something I pushed for very, very hard, which was basically a low price trigger. So that if the price of oil and gas came down to a certain point, the Energy Profits Levy would be removed and it would go back to what it was, which was already twice as much as what most businesses pay in corporation tax. So that was a sort of a fallback, if you like. Now, unfortunately, when that was first introduced, I thought the trigger price for oil, certainly for gas, was set too high. And I didn't think those are realistic. In fact, the OBR, or Office for Budget Responsibility, stated that they didn't think there was a realistic possibility of those trigger points being reached. But as we've seen in recent months, the oil price has been quite low. It has been below that trigger point, but the gas price hasn't. I think the gas price was set at 50 pence a therm, and it's been hovering around the 80 pence a therm mark. The oil price was set at $71 a barrel, and it's been routinely below that for the last, 2-3 months.
Yeah.
But it has to be at that level for 6 months. And that was something that I'm quite proud of, actually. I fought very hard behind the scenes to get that into legislation. I didn't. So something you find when you're a backbench MP on the same side as the government, it doesn't always pay to jump up and down and be angry at your own government all the time.
No.
So a lot of this horse trading type stuff gets done behind the scenes. But a lot of that was done with quite heavy engagement from the industry as well. I don't know if you saw me on LinkedIn last night, I think it was. Someone came on back of one of my posts saying, "No, what the industry needs to do is get together and decide who they need to talk to in government and go talk to them." I said, "Trust me, as a former government minister, there is a lot of that going on, not just from oil and gas, but from every industry you can possibly imagine, including offshore renewables, hydrogen, carbon capture, solar, wind, anything you can imagine." So that engagement does happen. I think the main problem we have as politicians and as an industry is the public perception. And right now, the public think Greta Thunberg's right. And anybody associated with the oil and gas industry must be wrong by default because we're associated with the oil and gas industry. So we would say that, wouldn't we? When in fact, most of the people I know in the industry, certainly at an executive level, I mean, companies like BP and Shell and the big multinational companies, they're making huge amounts of profit, as is often reported. But they're making that right across the world. They're not necessarily making it here in the North Sea. And by the way, the windfall tax only applies to profit made here in the North Sea.
Yeah, exactly.
So, again, you're killing off the investment. You're discouraging companies. Like Apache have decided, right, that's it, we're off.
Yeah.
Other companies are casting jobs left, right, and centre. And these companies are, if they're not already operating overseas, they're looking for opportunities to operate overseas. Because no other country is discouraging oil and gas production in the same way. And those other countries will quite happily export their oil and gas for us to burn.
Yeah.
Where most of the emissions come from. So, but again, and I apologise if some of your listeners have switched off during this. If they continue to think it's dull as ditch water because just tell me which side you're on, kind of thing.
Yeah.
It's not a question of picking sides. It's a question of what do we need to do.
That's what I say. Yeah,
and when
that's what I say.
When I was working in oil and gas, when I was working for companies like BP, then when I was working as a consultant with oil and gas companies as my client, it was all about, right, what's the problem you have? What do we need to do to fix it? And I didn't have all the answers. but I did have an ability to find people that could come together and come up with ideas of what those answers should be, and then to help those same people craft those ideas into things that they could do to make stuff happen. And a lot of it was taking, I mean, you'll recognize this, taking the operations guys and the maintenance guys who were always at loggerheads, not for personal reasons, but because the operations guys want to keep oil and gas flowing as much as they can.
Yeah.
The maintenance guys want to shut everything down so they can fix stuff. I mean, this may be an oversimplification, but there's that natural tension between those two departments. So, I mean, a lot of my work was getting these two guys in a room, or two groups of guys in a room, and saying, look, why does that pump over there keep breaking down? And the operations guys were saying, well, it's because maintenance keeps switching it off and they can't get started up again. And maintenance guys, the ops guys keep running too long, and bearings fail, and then it costs more to fix. And you get these guys just coming down to get them down to the raw data of what the problem is. And very often you get them to come together, and it's a joy to see actually these two previously opposing factions coming together and coming up with a different solution that neither of them had thought of individually.
Yeah.
And then agreeing to implement that solution. I hope your listeners don't mind me bragging a little. I think I got quite good at that until I became a politician. That just doesn't work in politics.
No.
You can't say, oi, Conservatives, SNP, Labour, let's go all in a room and let's figure out what's best for Scotland or what's best for the economy or what's best for this or that. And let's come up with a shared conclusion. Can't do that because we've got the party line and we've got this party's line. And we can't even be seen to agree.
Yeah.
Never mind agree behind the scenes. But actually, not to paint politicians in too bad a light, there is actually quite a bit of that behind the scenes collaboration does go on. It's just not done in front of the cameras, and I don't think the cameras would be interested if it did, or the newsreaders wouldn't be interested if it did. But I'll give you a great example: the North Sea transition deal, which was a great example of industry and government coming together. And actually, I mean, it was one industry and one party's government coming together, so it didn't really involve the other opposing parties, but it was industry and government coming together and deciding, well, what do we need to do? What's in the realm of the possible? What would just be too difficult? Let's not even think about it. There was a bit of back and forth, but I think what came as a result, the North Sea transition deal, which involved things like the skills passport, which is well on the way to being implemented. It included targets by the oil and gas industry, agreed by the oil and gas industry, that production emissions would reduce by 25%, 50%, 75%, and then zero by 2050. I can't remember the exact dates. I think it was it 25% by this year, and it's already in the 30s. And there was various other carbon capture and storage. Implementation was another one. But that took a lot of not just industry working with government ministers, but I think I was an MP. I was backbench MP at the time, but I had quite a good relationship with Kwasi Kwarteng, who was, everyone remembers him as the Chancellor in the mini budget. And at the time, he was a damn good energy minister. And I'll always say Kwasi Kwarteng was one of the best energy ministers I ever worked with, especially when they ask about the mini budget. But I had a good relationship with him, and Stephen Flynn, Westminster leader, I think at the time, Ian Blackford was still the Westminster leader. Stephen Flynn was the energy spokesperson for the SNP, always shouting at Kwasi from across the House, saying, when's this? Well, it wasn't called the North Sea Transition Deal at the time, it was called the Oil and Gas Sector Deal. When's this sector deal going to be delivered? When are we going to see the paperwork? When are we going to... And me and him would actually collaborate behind the scenes, and I said, look, Stephen, you keep asking these awkward questions. Here's some guidance on specifically what questions to ask. Now I'm going to go and work on Kwasi behind the scenes in the background and give him some coaching. All right, that's SNP bugger. He's going to ask these questions. Here's how you need to answer them. And it wasn't all to do with that. I think the industry probably deserved most of the credit, particularly the trade body that at the time was OG UK, became OE UK. They had a lot to do with actually brokering the detail of that deal that actually ended up in the paperwork. But politically, that was just one example of me and an SNP MP sort of cajoling policy decisions from the background. I mean, and that kind of thing happens in more official terms as well, through select committees, cross-party groups. You'll have people from different parties all interested in one particular subject, and they'll work together behind the scenes and then write a report, and then that goes to government with recommendations, some of which may even be implemented. But again, you never really see that on the 6 o'clock news unless somebody says something controversial. So I think 90% of what politicians do probably goes unseen, unreported. Mostly, I would say, most of what me and my team did was just basically look after my constituents, many of whom didn't care whether the oil and gas industry lived or died.
Do you think the oil and gas industry's done a good enough job of explaining the way its roles got to be implemented into the transition? As I don't know, maybe it's just me, maybe I just don't feel like you hear enough from them about what their inputs are on it and whatnot, because ultimately these are the companies that pay millions towards, well educated people and like
Yeah.
Brilliant people to work out what they can do to bring down their emissions, etc. But I don't feel like you get enough from them to explain that, look, you guys can't just switch off oil and gas tomorrow. We can do XYZ to help, but we can't just do it overnight.
I mean, I've seen some oil and gas executives, I won't name them, almost literally blue in the face putting that story across.
No.
It's not that they don't. It's not that they're not communicating. I think they very much are communicating. They'll communicate with ministers and their civil servants, and they'll communicate very well with select committees, and the message is being put across to ministers. But the problem is, and I say this as a recovering politician, semi-retired politician, I don't know if I'll be back, but we'll see. Politicians have always got one eye on what their voters will think.
Yeah.
And I think in the old days, when people didn't really care what their politicians did until a general election came up once every 5 years.
Yeah.
But since in the era of 24/7 news, literally second by second coverage on social media, there's a lot more pushback from the public if something even looks like being a little bit off from what the public think they want. And so there's a very natural tendency for politicians to say, well, I'm not going to announce this difficult decision or difficult policy because the public's not going to like it. And that can be done well or it can be done badly. I mean, we've seen with the backlash to Labour's strange, very early decision in the government to remove the winter fuel allowance from a lot of people. I think they probably thought, we'll get that out of the way early in our term, and then by the next election,
they've forgotten about it. Yeah.
But social media just ripped them to shreds.
Yeah.
Opposition parties. I mean, that's what you do. I've always said the NHS, for example, is broken. I mean, I spent 7 months at the NHS's pleasure last year, and I've got a lot to be grateful to them for. The individual nursing staff, doctors, physiotherapists, occupational therapists, cleaners, everyone that I had dealings with during my time in hospital were absolutely brand new. And I've also dealt with the middle management and the upper management of the NHS. And a lot of them are trying to do the best they can as well. But what became clear to me was there's no communication up or down through the levels. There's a lot of things left unsaid because, we can't tell the managers that we've run out of bedpans because they'll just give us a hard time for running out of bedpans. So let's see if we can scrape together some bedpans from somewhere.
Yeah.
But the natural, I'm not saying that that's something that happened. I'm just using that as an example. But what ends up happening, and I saw this happening in the industry as well, if the issues are not being adequately reported and dealt with, then the middle management and upper management will just assume there's no problems. And they'll think, well, my workforce are managing fine. They're managing to complete all their work as far as we know. But under the surface, you've got nurses, for example, burning themselves out just trying to look after people, which is all they want to do. They want to look after their patients. But I've seen so many people in the medical profession just get burned out and had to leave, which is a real shame. I don't know how do I get onto that subject?
We were talking about.
You asked the question about.
Yeah, basically, have they done enough? And I'm thinking of one
communication.
just while you're speaking. Yeah, the communication, because you're saying they're speaking to the black and blue, to the ministers, and that's obviously that's behind closed doors and stuff like that. But with the power of social media, with the power of technology, TikTok, for example, which is down everyone's throats nowadays, would they not be better almost implementing their own PR campaign to try and get these views across, to get
Yeah.
maybe these people get more understanding? Because obviously, say you've got old John from, I don't know, whatever constituency, and he's, obsessed with his party's views, and he just listens to that. But if he stumbles across other things, because you can find anything on TikTok nowadays, let's be honest. But if you've got these big companies trying to get this view across to, maybe it's not all about Greta, or maybe there is another side to it, then is that not a way of kind of getting the masses to understand as well?
Yes, absolutely. And I think it's something I've seen the Offshore Energies UK trade body. They changed their name from Oil and Gas UK because they started taking on membership of offshore wind companies as well. So they are very much an integrated offshore energies trade body. And
Yeah.
they do a fantastic job of pulling together these papers, engaging with the industry, right across the industry, because not every company agrees. Not every
No.
executive agrees on the best way forward. That they do an excellent job of getting a general feeling of what needs to be done. And they put it across very well. I mean, if you go on the OE UK website and read some of the papers, if you're inclined to, if you're interested, if you're not interested and somebody says, here, read this 30-page document, you're going to think, oh, what a snooze fest. You have to be interested in the first place.
Yeah.
And I think most people out there, so your energy minister, he's going to be interested. His civil servants, or her, civil servants, her. We've got a female energy minister in the Scottish government, for example, who also happens to be my MSP. I should write that. They will be very interested in what the industry has to say, but then they have to go back to their respective cabinets, and you've got an environment secretary, and you've got an environment minister, and you've got the chancellor who doesn't want to spend any money on anything. And I've never been a cabinet minister. I was a junior minister, but yeah, I know how difficult that is, and the to get your priorities across. It's the same in any boardroom, in any business. So I don't think the industry can be faulted, particularly with the likes of OE UK and Aberdeen and Grampian Chamber of Commerce, for example. They do an excellent job as well, sticking up for the industry. I don't think they can be accused of not communicating their points across to government ministers or to the public, indeed, because I see these points coming across regularly in the media. But again, I'm interested. You probably see them as well because you're interested. If you're in the industry, you're going to be interested, but you're probably already convinced as well. And it's the people out there who need to be convinced. There's a cohort of people who will never be convinced otherwise. But there's a lot of people out there that really don't know one way or the other. If the guy on the news tells them one thing, they'll say, well, yeah, it might as well be true. Or if they go trawl through the internet and find conspiracy theories that the earth is flat, they might believe that as well. There's so much information out there, and nobody knows who to trust anymore. And it's something I've been grappling with even recently, since I've stopped being an MP. But I've still got a lot of contacts in the industry, meet up from time to time, and grapple with this idea of why is the core, central, pragmatic, sensible message of what actually needs to be done. Why can we not get that cut through? And I think there is just a media and public appetite for the extremes, for the sexy versions or the controversial, and it's it's something I have literally stayed up at night thinking, how can we change that? Something needs to change. You'll be familiar with Einstein's definition of insanity, doing the same thing over and over again, expecting different results. So something needs to be done differently, and I think I'm starting to hear from a lot of people and speak to a lot of people that are coming to that same conclusion, but I've yet to meet somebody who has the solution to how we do that differently. But I think there is a recognition that, and again, it's not the ministers that need to be convinced, it's the public that the ministers are ultimately beholden to that need to be convinced. I mean, I'll never forget talking to Rishi Sunak immediately. And in fact, I think it was the same morning, later on that day, he announced, when he was still Chancellor, the energy profits levy, the windfall tax. And it wasn't just me, there were some other like-minded individuals in the office with him. And he was saying, look, I know this is a bad idea, but 80% of the public want it to happen. And it's a very difficult thing as a Chancellor of the Exchequer or a Prime Minister or even just some guy in a podcast to say to 80% of the public that they're wrong.
Yeah, I know.
And what I think, and I don't think the public are wrong, I think what was wrong was the question that was being asked. And the question being asked when Russia invaded Ukraine, well, it wasn't just Russia invading Ukraine, this is a very important point. We'd just come out of the COVID lockdown, and the whole world supply chain was waking up and getting back into the swing of things. And that was like, I mean, it makes an oil tanker turning look fast.
Yeah.
That takes a long. It doesn't take long for a global supply chain to shut down, but it takes a long time to start up. And we were still experiencing that when Russia invaded Ukraine. And as energy-intensive industries were coming online from COVID, and there was a shortage of hydrocarbons to fuel those industries, prices were already shooting up for quite a couple of 2 or 3 months maybe before Russia invaded Ukraine. Obviously, that accelerated the oil price increase, or energy price increase, I should say. So something had to be done. And when people were asked, do you want your energy prices to come down, and do you want someone else to pay for it? Well, of course. I mean, you and I would both say yes to that question.
You've got no choice. You've got no chance of you, really.
I'd actually like to meet some of the 20% that said, well, no, that's a bad idea. Because they were probably just that bit more insightful and thought, no, this is not feasible.
That doesn't sound right. Yeah.
But this is what happens. Our politicians, and I count myself among them, are beholden to what the public think they need. And it's not because the public are daft. They may have different priorities. They may have other things going on with it. Like I couldn't meet with you yet. I couldn't have this podcast with you yesterday because I was sitting in the process selling my wife's car. Things happen. Things get in the way.
Yeah, exactly.
Things become more important than what everyone else thinks is important. And it's really difficult to get people interested in politics beyond the odd headline they might see. I mean, it's a huge percentage of people. I can't remember what the number is, but it's up in the 70s, 80s, maybe even 90s by now. Percentage of people who get their news from social media.
Yeah, I can imagine.
They don't sit down and watch the 6 o'clock or 10 o'clock news. As biased as that might sometimes be, they pick a website, or they pick a social media channel, or they pick somebody's podcast and get all their information from that. And like I said, it's one thing to maybe be on the verge of identifying what the problem is. It's a totally different thing to fix it. But I think there are a lot of people out there that put that sensible, pragmatic approach across, and they put it across very well. And they talk to the right decision makers. Some of these people get good access to energy ministers and prime ministers from time to time, and first ministers and other decision makers. But those decision makers then have to incorporate that information with all the other information that they're getting from elsewhere. Which, going back to something I said earlier on, I think there's a lot of people on the extreme environmental activist side of the spectrum that have somehow, I mean, they've done a great PR job of putting their switch off oil and gas tomorrow view across as if, well, of course we have to do that. There's no question. But actually, I mean, that idea of we have to stop oil and gas exploration immediately. I mean, that's what these people say. But if we do that, and if we stop producing, and we stop exporting and selling oil and gas, I mean, there's 300 million people on the planet that haven't even moved on to using oil and gas for their energy. They're still using harvested wood and cow manure.
Yeah.
for their energy. And there are other economies that have started an industrial revolution of sorts based on where their economy was maybe 50 years ago. And it's very, very easy for us in the developed G7 type world to say, well, we need to somehow accelerate those people all the way through that process that we spent the last 300 years going through to get to net zero. And it's a laudable objective. It's just wrought with impossibilities. And I think, I don't know if you've ever been in a role where like a project management type role where you tell you that you've got a project and you're managing a project to a timeline, a critical path. You'll tell whoever it is you answer to, your boss, the guys in the office offshore, the shareholders, there's a 90% chance that this will be the outcome. You call that the P90. There's a 50% chance that this will be the outcome. That's P50. P10 is the 10% chance of this outcome. And I was exchanging views with somebody just the other day on this. I think what's happened over recent years is we've started with a P10 target, and then other people have come in and added on their own 10% possibilities. And what you end up with, 10% of 10% of 10%, ends up being that's a 0%.
Yeah,
effectively chance of this ever happening. And I don't think we need to roll back and do nothing, which is the view of some people. But I do think we need to be challenging with the highest emitting industries, but at the same time realistic in what we can expect them, or how we can expect them to transition from where they are today to where we need them to be in 25 years. And again, that's the other thing, is when you get people saying, no, we need to do this tomorrow. 25 years is too long. When it was the Independent Climate Change Committee themselves who set out the original net zero by 2050 idea. But even then, it was like, yeah, but it is possible, or rather, it's not impossible. But there's a whole bunch of very, very, very difficult things that need to happen between now and then. And then I'm going to give my own government a bit of a hard time. I think we set net zero by 2050 into law under Theresa May. And then we spent the next 5 years, 4 or 5 years, going around the world talking about it, telling everyone how clever we were. Then we had COP26. So again, all eyes were on Glasgow for how the UK were going to reach net zero. But in that time, with the exception of the odd white paper here and there, I don't really remember anything actually being done to progress our way to net zero. And anything I do remember being done was actually being done by the oil and gas industry and by the renewable sector. They were building stuff.
Yeah.
So offshore wind farms were being built. But in order to meet Ed Miliband's clean superpower by 2030 target, I think it's something like 1.5 or 1.4 wind turbines has to be built, installed, in full operation. 1.5 or 1.4 every day between now and 2030.
Oh, it's never.
That's just physically impossible. As much as you want to do it, it's just not going to happen.
No chance.
And there's a bit of emperor's new clothes about it, because nobody wants to be the one telling the boss that, yeah, that's not going to happen, boss. But I don't know how. Again, if every time you get a new person coming into the role of supposedly leading the country's energy transition to net zero, and they're adding their own P10 extension to it.
Yeah.
They might look good in the short term because I'm going to be even more ambitious, but what they're actually doing is reducing the possibility of any of it happening.
Yeah.
By the way, a lot of this stuff I'm saying today is coming to me for the first time.
Yeah, well, that's good. There you go. It's there you go.
You can.
That's what I don't listen to any of mine anyway, so I can't stand the sound of my own voice. So I've actually changed.
It goes back to what I was saying. Sorry, I was just finished that point. It goes back to what
I
was saying earlier about the polling of 80% of the public wanting a windfall tax. That wasn't the answer. It was a question that was wrong. So you're obviously asking lots of good questions.
Yeah, I don't know about that. Like, some of them are winged. But what I have done is I've actually changed my my closing out question, because I found that everyone was pretty much giving the same answer, and I myself was thinking, well, my answer would be exactly the same that everyone's come on. So I've actually changed it to something a bit more like that you'll actually get a better answer out. So If you look back on your career now, is there anything that stands out as your proudest moment?
Because the old question was what was the old question?
Would
Is
you
there
had,
anything I
yeah,
regret, or would I have
yeah.
done
Is there
anything
anything
different?
that, yeah, would you have done anything different? Pretty much, yeah. But I've changed it. I've found
Yeah,
I got a bit bored of asking it as well, to be honest.
and I think I'm the kind of person. I think, as I was saying earlier, the kind of resilience and thick skin and roll up your sleeves and get on with it attitude that I think I've developed from working offshore
Yeah,
sort of leads to the same conclusion of, well, I'm not going to think about things I might regret, because what can you do about it? You can
yeah,
learn from
exactly.
things, certainly. Um, but in terms of things I'm most proud of, crikey, I mentioned the low trigger point for removing the EPL. I put a lot of hard work behind the scenes into getting that over the line. And I was actually in hospital by the time I was actually put into law. But I was glad to see that happen. I think the trigger points were set too low, in my opinion, and I was all set to argue against them, but my spinal cord had other ideas and ended up in hospital when the debate happened. But I was quite proud of that. I was proud of when, I don't know if you remember, the government, again, for emissions purposes, the government decided to remove the use of duty-free red diesel in certain industries, but it was kept for farming. Now, when you went onto the gov.uk website, it just said farming or agriculture. As, and a lot of people were coming to me as their local MP saying, well, what does that mean? Can we have ploughing matches? Can we have charity tractor runs? Can we have agricultural shows? Can we run diesel generators at agricultural events that involved with training and learning? And this just wasn't at all clear. So I spent a lot of time with the Exchequer Secretary at the time, Helen Whately, sitting down and deciding. She was a rural MP as well, so she probably had other similar concerns from her constituents. Yeah, but she and her officials, with my input and input from other rural MPs, came up with a more extensive list to make it clearer what was included and what wasn't. And so ploughing matches were included, agricultural shows were included. So the organisers of those were all happy. Charity tractor runs. I don't know if you've ever come across these when you're driving in the countryside and you get a massive queue of tractors, vintage tractors, all doing something for charity, and shaking buckets in your face. Well, it turned out that they were never allowed to use red diesel. Apparently,
No.
they were never exempt. So it was very difficult to say, well, how do you make something that wasn't exempt before still exempt? Because it can't be, because it wasn't exempt before. And I just said, just add it to the list. Nobody will know. And, well, I guess anybody listening to this podcast will know. But I was very pleased on behalf of local organisers of charity tractor runs that they could now um, be worry-free when they put red diesel in their charity vintage tractors. I mean, but I think the one thing I think I'm probably most proud of, and I've got a team behind me to thank for this as well. The team that basically ran my office when I was busy doing interviews and podcasts and such like. But we all work by the same mantra. Like, whatever I do in Westminster, whatever I do as a minister or as a government whip, and whichever podcast I happen to be a guest on or turn up on TV, doing whatever, it's always the constituents, the people that vote for me. They're the only ones that matter, really. And they're the ones that need to be kept happy. So nobody got ignored. Not everybody necessarily got the answer they needed, but everyone got a response. I would always try to help someone, even if, I mean, I had colleagues and sometimes even staff members saying, no, we've done this before and they can't be helped. I said, well, let's try at least. And yeah, more often than not, the conclusion was the same. Yeah, we couldn't help them, but sometimes we could help them. And that one constituent that you might help every now and again was worth its weight in gold. And I think just always having a team that were always focused on helping the constituents. I mean, even to the point of, I would say to my office manager, oh, I was on Channel 4 News last night. She, I don't care. You've got 5 emails in your inbox that you need to get clear by the end of the week.
Aye. Yeah, crack on.
I think that's the thing I'm most pleased with, and I think I was vindicated in that. just very quickly I've mentioned a couple of times being in hospital last year.
Yeah.
What happened was I had a spinal stroke. It's a bit like having a stroke in your brain, except it's in your spinal cord. So my
Yeah.
brain's fine, or at least as fine as it ever was. But because you've heard of people breaking their back, breaking their neck, and they get paralysed from the neck down. That kind of happened to me, but it was what they call an incomplete injury. So it didn't completely sever the connection between my brain and the rest of my body, but it left me paralysed temporarily for a few weeks. And during those few weeks, I got pneumonia. And then when I got past pneumonia and started getting my mobility back, so the nerves were reconnected, but my muscles had wasted away. So I had to go through a lot of physiotherapy. And I'm now, a little over a year later, I'm still hobbling about in crutches a little bit. But it's been like I said, I've got a lot of gratitude for the NHS people that looked after me during that time, especially in intensive care and the physiotherapists. I wouldn't be where I am today without them. But during the time I was in hospital, a predecessor of mine as MP for Banff Buckton, Alex Salmond, passed away.
Yeah.
Sorry, well, yeah, I'll come back to, I'll come back to what I was going to say. But when he passed away, you had people like David Cameron, who was Prime Minister during his time, and foreign leaders, American presidents, and people from all over the world recognising this great man, this great champion of Scotland and the Scottish people, and a great speaker in the House of Commons, and a worthy opponent in politics. But whenever people in what became my constituency, what used to be his constituency, were asked what they thought of Alex Salmond, so, oh, he helped me get my planning permission for my loft conversion, or he helped my daughter get her passport,
Yeah.
and I thought, that's great, because that's all the stuff I've been asking my team to focus on, so I must have been right. But although nationally and internationally he was remembered for all kinds of things, locally he was remembered for just being a good MP.
Yeah.
Regardless of whatever else he was getting up to in his spare time, which I won't go into. But
No, we'll avoid that one.
His time focused on helping his constituents.
Yeah.
But I think it's a shame he never heard those tributes when he was still alive, or maybe he did. But I was in the fortunate position of being at death's door. I came all right. I'm basically fine now. I can do everything I used to be able to do. I'm just a bit wobbly. I don't think I'd be able to go offshore again, unfortunately.
No.
But I was in that situation where people would otherwise not say anything. I got all these messages, whether it was online or directly, of support and gratitude for different things that I'd done for them or my team had done for them over the previous 7 years. And I think, going back to your question, I think the fact that me and my team maintained that as our main focus, looking after our constituents, every single one of them that contacted us to the best of our ability. I think that's probably the thing I'm most proud of. And the fact that I was able to get myself into hospital allowed myself to get those sort of messages that I would never have heard otherwise. I think that's probably the one thing that I know it's more of a general thing, but I think that's the one thing that would stand out. I think.
No, that's good. That's a good way to wrap it up as well, David. I like that. I haven't
gone on too long.
No, don't worry about that. I'm sure it's. I try not. Well, I think it's one of them. And a podcast is. Some people might like long ones, some people might like short ones, but you can always take it in turns. Like I find myself watching films as the series nowadays. I only watch them in about 20-minute intervals anyway. So I'll be there when you come back.
I'm going to say as well, I'm a big fan of your podcast. I really enjoy. You could have somebody like Chris Lemon on one week, the guy that survived being stuck in the bottom of the sea for 45 minutes or something.
Yeah.
And then you have just some bloke you used to work with, like a couple of weeks ago. and then you got people that survived Pfeiffer Alpha and Deepwater Horizon.
Yeah. Well, I try and keep it mixed up and whatnot. I think the one thing I think that gets forgotten about the oil industry is there is the obviously there's the big incidents that make the mainstream media and stuff like that, but there is men and women that are working it day to day as well that have their own story as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I've recommended, I don't know if they've actually listened to it, but I've recommended your podcast to friends of mine who used to work offshore or maybe still work offshore. I mean, for me, I find it quite nostalgic because my main experience offshore was between 92 and 2000, and I've been back and forth now and again,
Yeah.
ad hoc here and there, but never really permanent since then. And it's just great to hear perspective on how things are, some things have changed and some things stay the same.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate you coming on though, David, as well. Like it's sometimes it's difficult. Like I mentioned to a couple of people before in the past, I probably send out I don't know how many messages at a time. Some get ignored, which I'm happy enough with. Like I don't give up on them. Like I just come back again a couple of weeks later and just see if they'll answer it. But it does mean a lot when people like yourself say yeah and come on. It really does make it a lot more easier. Put it that way.
Well, I know the first time you asked me, I wasn't too sure because I thought, well, who wants to? Nobody's going to want to hear about my political side of things. But I think over the weeks that came after that, there was a lot of political stuff happening.
Yeah.
I just thought, well, maybe it might be interesting to some people.
No, I think it is. I think there's plenty. I think during the current, climate and the situation we're in terms of with the way our government's gone about things in comparison to other places, I think it's very relevant.
Well, I hope your listeners enjoy. Had a good day.
Yeah, good.